Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to pursue a question that was first put on June 1st to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans. And I'm very glad that we have this procedure in adjournment proceedings, because it's very difficult in the short time available to put a question together, as we all know in question period, Mr. Speaker, to fully explain the context. So I'm going to return to my question and more fully explain it and put it again to the Parliamentary Secretary. I started in my question by quoting a quite extraordinary letter written by 4 former Ministers of Fisheries and Oceans, the Honourable Tom Siddon, the Honourable John Fraser, the Honourable Herb Dhaliwal, and the Honourable David Anderson. They all happen to be from British Columbia, and but they don't happen to be in the same party, 2 Liberals, 2 Progressive Conservatives. And what they said at one point in the letter, and I quoted part of this paragraph in my question, but here's the quote. With respect to process, and in context, Mr. Speaker, this is related to those 4 gentlemen calling on this government to withdraw from the Omnibus Budget Bill those sections that have no place being there in destroying the Fisheries Act. What they say is, quote, with respect to process, we find it troubling that the government is proposing to amend the Fisheries Act via omnibus budget legislation in a manner that we believe will inevitably reduce and weaken the habitat protection provisions. Regrettably, despite the significance of the legislation, to date, the responsible ministers have provided no plausible, let alone convincing rationale for proceeding with the unusual process that has been adopted. Now, this is the section I quoted in my question to the honourable member. Quite frankly, Canadians are entitled to know whether these changes were written or insisted upon by the Minister of Fisheries or by interest groups outside the government. If the latter is true, who are they? Close quote. And in putting this question forward on June 1st, I added, where are they? In Canada or in Beijing? Now, I know my honourable friend found that, in his words, a strange question. So let me elaborate on why I think that is the question. We're looking at a lot of changes in Canadian environmental assessment law, in changes to put Cabinet superior to the National Energy Board for decision-making purposes. We're looking at changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act, Fisheries Act, Species at Risk Act, and they're in aid of what's described as a great urgency to approve projects. Now, I've had some experience with this, Mr. Speaker, and my experience with projects of the Government of Canada, in the case I'm going to relate to you, it involved the previous government of Right Honourable Jean Chrétien, in a feverish attempt to sell nuclear reactors to China. They actually loaned China the money to buy our reactors and wanted to evade environmental review. Now, at the time I was at Sierra Club of Canada, and I actually took them to court, and unfortunately, due to a number of procedural delays imposed on us by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, the matter never got litigated. But the crux of it is this. When Canada deals with China, in my experience, Canada reduces its environmental reviews. Now, in this instance, we have a tremendous number of changes that make no sense to Canadians. They make no sense to people who've worked in fisheries and oceans. They make no sense particularly to these 4 former fisheries ministers, nor to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that voted an emergency resolution this week to withdraw those changes. And what's driving it? Well, it seems to me that the Prime Minister gave us a sense of that with 2 statements. One was May 10th in this House in response to the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party. The Prime Minister said, it is vital to the certainty, reducing environmental assessments, he said, is vital to the certainty of our investors. At the same time, we know that the Prime Minister already promised the leadership in Beijing when he was visiting China that the Enbridge super tanker project would proceed. So it seems to me that it's a very relevant question. Who's driving these changes? Canadians or investors in the Communist Party of China? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank my colleague from Saanich-Gulf Islands for her continued interest in this issue. I think the short answer to the question that she raised, or that she included in her question originally, is that the latter is not true. But let me provide just a little bit more information. Mr. Speaker, the Fisheries Act was originally established to protect Canada's fisheries resources and defines federal responsibilities for the management of fisheries and the related protection of fish and fish habitat. The current habitat protection provisions of the Fisheries Act are broad in scope, requiring protection of all fish habitats regardless of their value to Canadians. Concerns about the broad and even the unintended scope of the application of the existing regulatory regime have been raised by stakeholders across the country, this country, Mr. Speaker, not China. Farmers and landowners have criticized the Department for applying its mandate and resources to areas with low contribution for fisheries. In addition, significant risks to fisheries have emerged that are not appropriately considered in the Fisheries Act, such as those posed by aquatic invasive species. Many stakeholders over the years have asked us to focus on the significant impacts to significant fisheries. Many stakeholders have also asked us to find ways to work more effectively with the provinces and conservation groups. They've asked us to apply our resources strategically to ensure that Canada's fisheries can benefit Canadians today and for future generations. In response to these challenges, the Government of Canada is proposing to renew and strengthen its current approach to management and fisheries protection through amendments to the Fisheries Act. These amendments would focus the government's protection efforts on recreational, commercial, and Aboriginal fisheries. They would also draw a distinction between vital waterways that support Canada's fisheries and those which do not contribute to productive fisheries, such as drainage ditches in some cases and stormwater management ponds. And they would identify and manage important threats to the fisheries, including direct impacts to fish, habitat destruction, and aquatic invasive species. Let me be clear that the rules will continue to protect Canadian fisheries waters from pollution, as they have in the past, and the proposed legislative amendments would provide additional clarity on the application of the law. Mr. Speaker, proposed NC 38 are a new suite of tools that help strengthen our protection of commercial, recreational, and Aboriginal fisheries. We will now be able to identify ecologically significant areas, such as critical spawning habitat for sockeye salmon, and provide enhanced protection for those critical zones. In addition, infractions under the Fisheries Act will now be aligned with those set out in the Environmental Enforcement Act, which provides higher maximum penalties. This will ensure that those who break the rules are subject to stiffer penalties. Through these amendments, we will also be able to establish new, clear, and accessible standards for projects in or near water. It makes good common sense that the government should be able to minimize or eliminate restrictions on routine activities that pose little or no threat to fisheries, while at the same time maintaining appropriate, reasonable, and responsible protection for Canada's commercial, recreational, and Aboriginal fisheries. A renewed Fisheries Act will provide us with the tools to develop effective regulations prohibiting the import, transport, and possession of live aquatic invasive species such as Asian carp, which are threatening the Great Lakes. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada takes the protection of our country's commercial, recreational, and Aboriginal fisheries very seriously. Given the importance of the fisheries from coast to coast to coast, we must focus our efforts on the effective protection of these fisheries. Their long-term sustainability and productivity are our priority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, member for Saanich-Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my honourable colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Oceans. He's put forward that his goal is to renew and strengthen fisheries protection. If that's his goal, he should join me in trying to stop this legislation. It does nothing of the kind. The four former fisheries ministers with whom I referenced earlier have concluded in their letter that unless there are changes in this legislation, that we are in very serious trouble. And I'll quote again. They're commenting on these claims that the current legislation is so woefully inadequate. And what they say is, we can only judge from our own experience, which suggests that the shortcomings of the existing legislation have been greatly overstated, and that the remedial action proposed, in other words, this horrible legislation, is vastly out of proportion to the issues they have referred to, but only vaguely. In short, we have the impression that the ministers are using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. This legislation is deeply flawed, and I urge the Parliamentary Secretary and all ministers to reconsider.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we've given this very careful consideration. And in fact, two of those ministers to which she refers, the Honourable Tom Siddon, for example, it's his habitat policy written in 1986 that clearly says our focus needs to be on the protection of habitat, those habitats which support recreational, commercial, and Aboriginal fisheries. And then in 1998, that was in the time of the Honourable David Anderson. Then they issued another policy document that expanded on the habitat policy, which allowed the decision makers to know how to apply Section 35 of the Act. It again says very, very clearly that the focus has to be, as that is applied, on commercial, recreational, Aboriginal fisheries, and that's what we're doing with this legislation.